Imagine 6 investigations, each one working independently, no shared methodology, no access to each other's findings, different continents, different centuries, different languages, different cultural contexts, each one investigating the same question. What is consciousness? What is its relationship to physical reality? What happens to it when the body dies? And each one, independently, without collaboration, without knowledge of what the others found, arriving at a set of conclusions that overlap in significant ways. That is what happened. The Vedantic traditions of ancient India, the Buddhist tradition originating in the same region but reaching different conclusions. The Neoplatonic tradition of ancient Greece and Alexandria, the Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism, the Kabbalistic tradition of Jewish mysticism, the Taoist tradition of ancient China. 6 serious intellectual and contemplative traditions developed without meaningful contact with each other during their formative periods, investigating the nature of consciousness through disciplined practice, rigorous inquiry, and sustained interior observation. And finding not identical maps, the maps differ in significant ways, but maps that share a remarkable amount of common territory. I want to be precise about how I'm going to use this conversion because it is easy to overstate what it shows. The convergence of independent investigators does not prove their conclusions are correct. History contains cases of independent investigation converging on wrong conclusions. What the conversion does is this. It establishes that the consciousness, its primary claim, is not an exotic fringe. It is considered conclusion of some of the most serious, most rigorous, most sustained intellectual and contemplative inquiry in human history. Dismissing it requires dismissing not just one tradition, but 6, without adequate engagement with what any of them actually found or how they found it. That is a significant intellectual burden. This episode examined what they found, honestly, including where they disagree with each other, which they do on a significant point, and including what their shared ground remains after the disagreements are acknowledged. Let's begin with the tradition that has gone deepest into this territory. Vedanta, the deepest map. The Vedantic tradition, specifically Advaita Vedanta, as developed by Adi Shankaracharya in the 8th century Common Era, Upanishads, which themselves date to roughly 800 to 200 before Common Era, represents perhaps the most systematic and philosophical, sophisticated account of consciousness in the history of human thought. Its central claim is stated in what may be the most compressed philosophical proposition ever formulated. Tat Van Asi, that art thou. 3 words in Sanskrit, an entire metaphysics in 3 words. The claim is this: the consciousness that is reading these words, the awareness to which you are experiencing this moment, is identical in its deepest nature with the consciousness that is the ground of reality. Not similar to it, not a fragment of it, not a reflection of it, identical with it. The individual self, what Vedanta calls jiva, is not a separate entity that happens to share some properties with a universal consciousness. It is a universal consciousness. What Vedanta called Brahman or Atram appears in itself as an individual through mechanism of Maya. Maya is usually translated as illusion. That translation is misleading. Maya is better understood as the appearance of separateness, the condition in which the one consciousness experiences itself as many, in which Brahman appears to itself as Jiva, in which the universal appears as individual. The appearance is real. The separatedness it creates is not ultimately real. This is a precise and carefully philosophical position, not mystical vagueness, a specific claim about the ontological status of individual consciousness relative to universal consciousness. Shankaracharya spent his entire philosophical career. He died at approximately 32 years old and produced a body of work that has occupied serious scholars for 1,200 years, developing the logical implication of this position and defending it against sophisticated objections from rival schools. What Vedanta says about consciousness in the brain. Vedanta was not a neuroscience. It did not make claims about specific neural mechanism, but its account of the relationship between consciousness and the body is precise. Consciousness, chit, awareness of itself, is not produced by the body or the brain. It is the ground from which both arise. The body is a particular form taken by the universal consciousness for a particular period of experience. The jiva, the individual self, appears to be located in and independent on the body. But this appearance is itself a product of Maya. The underlying consciousness is not located anywhere. It does not begin with birth or end with death. It is nitya, eternal, not in the sense of lasting a very long time, but in the sense of being outside of time entirely. What Vedanta says about death. Death in the Vedantic account is the dissolution of the particular form through which the universal consciousness has been expressing as an individual. The jiva, the apparent individual self, ceases in its current form. But the consciousness that was expressing as that individual does not cease. It was never the individual, it was always Brahman. Dissolution of form is not the extinction of the awareness, it is a return of the wave to the ocean. The practice. What distinguishes Vedanta from merely philosophical idealism is its existence on direct experiential verification. The tradition does not ask you to accept the Atman Brahman identity on authority. It provides a methodology, primarily meditation and what is called Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, for directly experiencing the identity that philosophy describes. The claim is that when the Maya of the apparent separatedness is seen through, when the illusion of the individual self as a separate entity is directly perceived as illusion, what remains is the direct experience that the consciousness that the philosophy points toward. This is what the serious practitioners of the tradition report. Not a belief in a proposition, direct experience of the ground. Buddhism, the most challenging account. Buddhism deserves an extended treatment in this episode for a reason that may be surprising. It is a tradition that most directly challenges the consciousness's primary claim as I've been developing it. And engaging with that challenge is more valuable than presenting a false consensus. The Buddhist teaching on consciousness is one of the most suitable and most frequently misrepresented bodies of thought in human history. Let me try to state it precisely. The Buddha did not teach that consciousness is the ground of reality in the Vedantic sense. He explicitly rejected the Vedantic Atman. The permanent, unchanging individual self is identical with Brahman. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, non-self, holds that what we experience as a fixed, permanent individual self is a construction, a process, a collection of aggregates, skandhas, arising and passing dependence on condition. There's no unchanging essence underneath the aggregates. The self is rising, not something separate from it. This sounds like it contradicts the consciousness's primary position. In some formulation, it does. But the situation is more complex than the surface contradiction support. What Buddhism does and doesn't claim. Buddhism does not claim that consciousness is merely a product of physical processes. The skandhas include vijnana, consciousness, as one of the 5 aggregates, but consciousness in Buddhism is not reducible to the physical. Buddhism teach pratyasamutprada, dependence origin. Everything arises in dependence on condition. Consciousness arises in dependence on conditions. The physical body is one set of conditions, but the consciousness is not reducible to those conditions. The famous teaching on rebirth in Buddhism explicitly affirms that what continues across death is not a permanent self. That would be the Atman that Buddhism rejects, but a stream of consciousness, a continuation of causally connected mental events that continues beyond the death of the physical body. So Buddhism affirms something significant about consciousness and death. Consciousness continues. Something persists. The physical death does not end the stream. What it denies is the permanent individual self, the unchanging Atman that continues. Where Buddhism and Vedanta genuinely disagree. The disagreement is real and significant. It has been the subject of serious philosophical debates within Indian philosophy for over 2,000 years. Vedanta says, beneath the appearance of individual consciousness is the permanent universal consciousness. Atman is Brahman. Buddhism says there is no permanent self beneath the appearance, not even a universal one. What there is a stream of interdependent arising, casually continuous, but without a permanent essence as its ground. Some Buddhist schools, particularly certain Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the Yogacara or mind-only school, develop a position that comes closer to the Vedantic claim. The Yogacara school's concept of Alaya Vijnana, storehouse of consciousness, and the Tibetan concept of Rigpa, pure awareness, describes something that functions very similarly to what Vedanta calls Brahman. But the mainstream Theravada position and much of Madhyamaka philosophy maintain non-self teaching rigorously. What Buddhism contributes to this series. Despite the disagreement with Vedanta on the nature of what persists, Buddhism makes several contributions to the consciousness conversation that are significant and distinct. The insistence on direct experiential verification, ehipassiko, comes and see, is shared with Vedanta, but developed with particular rigor in Buddhist methodology. The extensive literature on meditative states, on the phenomenology of consciousness, on the different conditions, on the stages of what happens as ordinary consciousness is systematically examined. This is among the most detailed empirical literature on consciousness that exists. The insistence on direct experiential verification, ehipassiko, come and see, is shared with Vedanta, but developed with particular rigor in Buddhism methodology. The extensive literature on meditative states, on the phenomenology of consciousness, on the different conditions, on the stage of what happens as ordinary consciousness is systematically examined. This is among the most detailed empirical literature on consciousness that exists. The teaching on the bardo, the post-death transitional state as described in the Tibetan tradition, is one of the most detailed map of the consciousness transition at death in any tradition. And as noticed in episode 1, the features it described overlap significantly what near-death experiences report. The no-self teaching, properly understood, is not nihilism. It is the most direct challenge available in the assumption that the individual ego self is a fundamental unit of consciousness, which is in a different register. What the near-death experience also challenges the assumption that the self, as normally experienced, is a whole of what is consciousness. The assumption that the self, as normally experienced, is a whole of what consciousness is. Neoplatonism, the Western bridge. The Neoplatonic tradition, developed primarily by Plotinus in the 3rd century Alexandria and carried forward by Porphyry Lambicus Proclus, represents the most systematic philosophical accounts of consciousness in the Western tradition prior to the modern era. Plotinus is perhaps the greatest philosopher you have never heard of. His work, The Enneads, compiled by his student Porphyry, is a systematic philosophical account of reality that begins from a single principle he calls the One and traces the emanation of all reality from that principle. The One is beyond being, beyond thought, beyond description. It is a source from which everything proceeds through a process of emanation. From the One proceed the nous, the divine intellectual mind, the realm of pure intelligence, of the Platonic form, of the eternal archetypes of all things. From the nous proceeds the psyche, soul, the realm that bridges the intelligible and its material. From the psyche produces the higher, the matter, the most distinct expression from the One, the realm of physical existence. This is an explicit consciousness, is primarily cosmology. This is an explicit consciousness, is primary cosmology. Reality proceeds from pure consciousness, the One, outward into increasingly material expression. The physical world is not the ground of consciousness. It is the most distinct expression of consciousness. What Neoplatonism says about the individual self. The individual human soul is not a product of the physical body. It is a particular expression of the universal soul, the psyche, that has descended into a body for a period of embodied experience. The soul's task, its fundamental orientation, is return, the ascent back towards its source, back through soul towards nous, towards the One. Plotinus described this ascent in terms that any serious meditator will recognize: the progressive quieting of the ordinary mind, the withdrawal from sensory engagement, the direct encounter with the intelligible realm, and ultimately the mystical union with the One that he calls kenosis. He claimed to have experienced this union 4 times in his life. Death in Neoplatonism. Death is the release of the soul from the temporary embodiment, not the end of the soul. The soul continues, either returning to another embodiment in the Neoplatonic scheme of reincarnation, or progressing towards its ultimate return to the One. What does not survive death in Plotinus' account is the personality, the particular habits, memories, and characteristics of the embodied individual. What survives is the soul itself, a participation in the universal psyche that was always more than its temporary expression through a particular body. What Neoplatonism matters for this series. Why Neoplatonism matters for this series? 2 reasons. First, Neoplatonism is the direct philosophical ancestors of the Western divine man tradition. Fillmore, Holmes, and the broader New Thought tradition drew heavily sometimes explicitly, sometimes through intermediate sources on the Neoplatonic metaphysics. Understanding Neoplatonism is understanding the philosophical roots of the tradition examined in episode 4. Second, Neoplatonism represents a rigorous philosophical tradition, not a religious faith requiring revelation, that arrive at the consciousness its primary conclusion through systematic philosophical argument. Plotinus was making logical arguments, not making faith claims. His conclusion can be examined and challenged on their philosophical merits. That makes Neoplatonism particularly significant for the skeptical audience this series is trying to reach. It demonstrates that the consciousness is primary position is not merely a religious claim. It is a philosophical conclusion that serious thinkers have reached through rigorous arguments. Let's look at 3 further traditions. Having gone deeper into Vedanta, Buddhism, and Neoplatonism, I want to survey 3 further traditions more significantly, not because they are less significant, but because the depth work has been done, and what matters now is establishing the breadth of the convergence. Sufism, the Islamic mysticism. The Sufi tradition developed within Islam from the 8th century onwards through figures included Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Al-Halal, represent the mystical and the metaphysical heart of Islamic thought. The central concept for all purposes, Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of being, developed most systematically by the Andalusian mystic in Ibn Arabi in the 12th and the 13th century. Ibn Arabi's claim there is only one being, one reality, one consciousness. God, al-Haq, the real, is the only genuine existence. All of the creation, including the individual consciousness, is a self-disclosure of the one reality. The individual is not separate from the divine reality. The individual is the divine reality appearing to itself in a particular form. Fana, annihilation, is the Sufi term for the dissolution of the false sense of separation, not the destruction of the individual, but the recognition that the individual was never separate from the divine consciousness of which it is an expression. Al-Halal was executed in 922 Common Era for declaring that Ana al-Haq, I am the real. His executioners heard a claim to be God. What he was expressing in the technical language of Sufi metaphysics was the Vedantic Taktvan Asi in Islamic form. Death in the Sufi framework is final in the most complete sense, the final dissolution of the appearance, separation, the return of the individual expression to the divine ground from which it was never truly separate. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalistic tradition crystallized in the Zohar in the 13th century Spain and developed further in the 16th century, spread through figures like Isaac Lura, represent the metaphysical and mystical dimension of Jewish thought. The Kabbalistic account of consciousness centers on the concept of Ein Sof, the infinite, the 10 sephirot, through which the infinite expresses in finite form. Ein Sof, literally without end, is the divine reality prior to all description, all attributes, all name, beyond being and non-being, the ground from which all emerges. The Sephirot are the 10 aspects or dimensions through which Ein Sof expresses, from the most abstract Keter crown through the most concrete Malkut kingdom, the physical form. Individual human consciousness, the neshama, the divine soul, is the spark of the divine fire, not a separate creation that happens to resemble divine, a particularization of the divine consciousness. Death in the Kabbalistic framework is a return of the neshama to its divine source, the spark returning to the fire. The particular form of expression ceases. The consciousness that was expressed in that form returning to the Ein Sof, from which it was never truly separate. The Taoism, or the Taoism, the way. The Taoist tradition, rooted in the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi and developed through Zhuangzi and subsequent thinkers, approaches mysticism through a fundamentally different methodology than the traditions we have examined. The Tao, usually translated as the way, is the unnameable ground of all reality. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It is prior to heaven and earth. It is the source from which the 10,000 things emerges and to which they return. Individual consciousness, the mind, the spirit, is an expression of the Tao, not a product of the physical body, an expression of the underlying reality that is always already present. What distinguishes Taoism from the other traditions served here is resistance to systematic metaphysical elaboration. Where Vedantic develops a rigorous philosophical account and Neoplatonism builds a systematic cosmology, Taoism insists on the limits of conceptual thought. Tao cannot be captured in proposition. It can only be aligned with through wu-wei, effortless action, not interference with the natural flow. But the implicit metaphysics is clear. Consciousness is not separate from the Tao. Individual awareness is the Tao moving through a particular form. Death is the particular form returning to the Tao, like water returning to the ocean, like breath returning to the air. Now, let's look at where they diverge. I said at the beginning of this episode that I would acknowledge where these traditions genuinely disagree. The commitment matters. Here are the real divergences. On the nature of the individual self, Vedanta, Neoplatonism, Sufism, Kabbalah, and the Taoism all affirm in different language a permanent or ultimate self that underlies the apparent individual Atman soul. The divine spark, the neshama, the expression of the Tao. Buddhism, particularly Theravada and Madhyamaka Buddhism, explicitly denies this. There is no permanent self, not even a universal one. What continues is a stream of casually connected moments of consciousness, not a permanent entity. This is a genuine and significant disagreement. It is not resolvable by finding the right framing. The traditions are making different claims on the relationship between the individual and the universal. The traditions disagree on the degree of identity between individual consciousness and the universal ground. Advaita Vedanta takes the most radical position. They're identical. Atman is Brahman, not similar, not continuous, not in a relationship, identical. Sufism and Kabbalah tends towards a position of intimate relationship rather than strict identity. The individual is an expression of the divine, a disclosure of the real, a spark of the divine fire. But a relationship preserves some distinction even as it approaches unity. Neoplatonism maintains a hierarchical emanation structure in which the individual soul is real at its own level, but not strictly identical with the one. These are real differences in metaphysical position. On what specifically survives after death. The traditions also differ on what exactly continues after physical death. Vedanta says the individual jiva continues until it achieves liberation, moksha, at which point it is recognized its identity with the Brahman and the illusion of individual continually dissolve. Vedanta says the individual jiva continues until it achieves liberation, moksha, at which point it recognizes its identity with the Brahman and the illusion of individual continually dissolve. Neoplatonism affirms reincarnation. The soul continues through multiple embodiments until its return to the one. Buddhism affirms rebirth, but a stream that continues is not a permanent self. Sufism and Kabbalah describe the return to the divine ground, but the details of what that involves and whether individual identity persists vary significantly within each tradition. These are genuine divergences. I am not going to smooth them over. Now let's look at the shared ground. Having acknowledged genuine divergences, I want to be equally precise about what remains a shared ground after they are acknowledged. Because there's significant shared ground, and what is the shared ground that matters for the consciousness question? First claim, consciousness is not reducible to the physical. Every tradition surveyed here, including Buddhism, which disagrees with the others on the permanent self, denies that consciousness is merely a product of physical processes. Vedanta, consciousness is the ground, not the product. Buddhism, consciousness is one of the 5 aggregates, not reducible to the physical body. Neoplatonism, consciousness emanates from the one through nous. It does not emerge from matter. Sufism, consciousness is a self-disclosure of divine reality, not a biological accident. Kabbalah, the neshama is a divine spark, not produced by the body. Taoism, awareness is a Tao expression, not a function of physical complexity. 6 traditions, independent development, same conclusion. Consciousness is not reducible to the physical. Second shared claim. Something of consciousness continues beyond physical death. Every tradition surveyed here affirms with different account of what specifically continues and in what form that physical death is not the termination of consciousness. Vedanta, the jiva continues until liberation. Liberation is recognized of identity with Brahman. Buddhism, the stream of consciousness continues through rebirth. Neoplatonism, the soul continues through further embodiments and ultimately return to the one. Sufism, consciousness return to the divine ground, Fana. Kabbalah, the neshama returns to Ein Sof. Taoism, consciousness return to the Tao. The specific accounts differ. The shared consciousness is consistent. Physical death is a transition in the mode of consciousness expression, not its termination. Third shared claim. Direct experiential verification is possible. Every tradition surveyed here claims that the consciousness' primary conclusion is not merely a theological position to be believed. It is a territory to be directly entered through sustained practice. Vedanta, Jnana Yoga and meditation as the direct path to the experience of Atman Brahman identity. Buddhism, the Buddha's explicit invitation, the hei passiko, come and see. The meditative path as a direct investigation of consciousness. Neoplatonism, Plotinus Henosis, direct mystical union with the One through contemplative practice. Sufism, the Sufi path is direct approach to the Fana, the experiential recognition of unity with the divine. Kabbalah, Devkut, cleaving to God as the experiential dimension of the tradition. Taoism, the cultivation of stillness and alignment with the Tao as direct engagement with the underlying reality. 6 traditions, 6 different methodologies, the same insistence that the conclusion verifiable through direct experiencing, not just asserted through doctrine. What the convergent means and what it doesn't mean. I want to close this substantive content of this episode with what I said I would say. What the convergence means and what it doesn't. What it doesn't mean. Independent investigators converging on a conclusion is not the same as that conclusion being established. It is possible, in principle, that all 6 traditions have all arrived at the same wrong conclusions through different paths. The conversion does not also resolve the genuine disagreement within and between these traditions. Buddhism and Vedanta are making different claims about the permanent self. Those claims cannot be fully correct. The conversion exists at the level of the 3 shared consciousness. It does not exist at the level of the full metaphysical principle. And the conversions of the contemplative tradition does not substitute for the kind of evidence examined in episode 1 through 3. Traditions making claim is not the same as peer-reviewed research documenting verified perceptions during clinical death. These are making kinds of evidence requiring different kinds of evaluation. What it does mean. The convergence means that the consciousness's primary position has a serious, sustained, rigorous, developed intellectual lineage across a multiple independent cultural contexts. It is not an eccentric position held by credulous people. It is the considered conclusion of some of the most disciplined intellectual and contemplative inquiry in human history. The convergence means that the 3 shared claims, consciousness is not reducible to physical, something continued beyond death, direct verification is possible, are not the product of one tradition bias or one culture's wishful thinking. They have emerged independently across traditions that disagree with each other on many other significant points. And the convergence mean, when placed alongside the ND form, episode 3, and the hard problem and the quantum findings from episode 2, that we have something more than a single line of inquiry pointing in one direction. We have multiple independent lines of inquiry, scientific, philosophical, contemplative, converging on the same territory from different directions. That conversion does not close the question. It makes the question impossible to dismiss honestly. And that is precisely where this series wants to leave it. Not close, impossible to dismiss honestly. That is not intellectual position and the evidence and the tradition together support. 6 traditions, thousands of years of sustained inquiry, independent development across cultures that had no meaningful contact during their formative periods. 3 shared conclusions. Consciousness is not reducible to the physical. Something of consciousness continues beyond physical death. The conclusion is directly verifiable through sustained practice, not just belief through doctrine. And significant disagreements on other points that have not smoothed it over. The disagreement matter. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging them. The traditions are not all saying the same thing. They are saying related things, things that share significant common ground, while also making genuinely different claims about significant questions. What matters after the disagreements are acknowledged is more significant than a false consensus would be. Because the shared ground that survived honest scrutiny is more trustworthy than an apparent agreement that was never really there. The consciousness, its primary claim, is not a fringe position. It is not credulous. It is not the product of wishful thinking about death. It is considered conclusion of 6 serious independent intellectual traditions developed through sustained disciplined inquiry by some of the most rigorous minds in human history. It converges with the near-death experience evidence examined in episode 3. It converges with the hard problem and the quantum finding in episode 2. It is the framework within which my own 3 months in a coma at 7 years old is not an anomaly requiring explanation, but an expected finding of a reality in which consciousness is primary. The question remains. It should remain open, but it cannot be dismissed honestly by anyone who has examined what the evidence and the tradition actually show.